Sequoia Miller, who invited me to bring Indo-Caribbean voices into the Gardiner Museum. I want to thank his whole team, Natalia Goldsheen, the exhibitions manager, Jack McComb, installation, and for making the whole process seamless. And a particular thanks to Sama Kokabi for her amazing programming work for this whole 10-day Festival of International Ceramic Arts. And Richard Tang for his technical support. Also, a big thanks to the University of Toronto Women and Gender Studies program and the Caribbean Studies program for co-presenting and supporting and marketing and getting the word out about this evening. So, the first person I talked to about the exhibition, aside from Sequoia, the curator, well, actually, the first person was Richard Fun, sitting here. Tossed around some ideas, and then I spoke to Ramabai Espinet, who's on stage. And Ramabai is one of two people whose portrait is on the wall downstairs that I knew before I started this journey. I also knew Kamala Jean Gopi, but I think we had not spoken, I believe, for about 20 years. I met Ramabai in 1994. So I'm telling you a little bit of a personal story to start the evening on. I met Ramabai in 1994, and my then new boyfriend, now a life partner and soulmate of 29 years, took me, Ali Kazmi, took me to the Indo-Caribbean Literary Christmas Party. And I was dancing with this woman, and we were chatting, and she was talking to me about her Uncle Horace, and I said, wait a minute, that sounds an awful lot like my Uncle Horace. And as it happens, we are cousins.
There's a lot of relations on this panel.
Yes, so that's through Uncle Horace Mahabir. And then when I decided to focus the exhibition on Indo-Gender jewelry of the women, my research led me to Joy Mahabir's work, whom I did not know. And I was chatting with Ramabai on the phone, and she said, well, you do know Joy is a cousin. I said, no, I didn't know. And so we have Joy here tonight. And then 2.5 weeks ago, I got an email out of the blue from Stephen Russell. And he and his wife happened to be in town for a conference, and they happened to come to the Gardiner. They live in Philadelphia. And he said, I believe I'm your first cousin. I said, okay. And anyway, we have subsequently Zoomed and spoken, and it turns out that in fact he is the son of my father's youngest full sibling, whom he didn't know because there was a divorce, there was a whole Brady Bunch scenario, and that aunt of mine spent her adult life in Jamaica. So I now have Stephen and his two brothers as new cousins as well. So I think all in all, and I also want to say that tonight Ramabai has her sisters Patricia and Wendy with us, and at the opening there were six of my cousins who came to support Ramabai. So by my count, I'm up 9 cousins as a result of making this exhibition.
Thank you so much, Heidi, and congratulations on this really remarkable exhibition. My task today is very simple. It is to introduce everyone, and you'll see me on my phone. That's because I don't wear a watch to time them. And then I am not even going to, the program says I should start with a question. I was like, you see these people in the audience, they have a lot to say. So we are just going to open it to the Q&A as soon as our presenters finish. So what I will do is just introduce our presenters in the order in which they will speak. And then they will come up. Each person will speak for 15 minutes. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be part of this this afternoon's event. I have worked with, or still work with, both at the University of Toronto with Nalini when she was there, and with Rama. In fact, Nalini's father, Avin, I think I met Avin before Nalini, is also here, and I just wanted to say this, wonderful relations, but also this intergenerational kind of dialogue that hopefully we can generate tonight is really beautiful. So it's wonderful to have young people, my daughter is here, as well as, and she's probably like, why did you do that? As well as elders. I wanted to actually thank Ayo Gariba, who is a graduate from our program and is now our I have followed Joy's work for years, so it is a real privilege to be able to meet you and to hear you today. So without further ado, our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Ramabai Espinet. She's Trinidadian by birth and now lives in Canada. She is a writer, critic, and academic. She's retired from her position as Professor of English at Seneca College, but continues to lecture in Caribbean Studies at New College, University of Toronto. She also continues to serve on doctoral committees, and I'm really privileged to work with her with two remarkable Indo-Caribbean students, Suzanne Narayan and Priya Suraj Valley. Ramabai Espinet's creative works include a novel, The Swinging Bridge, Nuclear Seasons, poetry, and Indian Rubber Talk, performance poetry. She's the editor of Creation Fire, a remarkable anthology of 121 Caribbean women's poetry in several languages, which was published in 1990. In 2008, Rama was awarded the Nicholas Guillen International Prize for Philosophical Literature. A documentary on her work, Coming Home, has been done by Leda Serene, Caribbean Tales. Rama will be followed by Dr. Nalini Mohibir, who is an associate professor in the geography department at Concordia University and an occasional contributor to the newspaper Indo-Caribbean World. Nalini actually didn't put this down, but she's also just co-edited a remarkable collection with Ronald Cummings called The Fire That Time, which is really about the student uprisings at Concordia University. If you don't know about it, you should, because it was one of the most important and certainly the most expensive student riot in the history of Canadian universities. But it's a really wonderful collection. And we will close with Joy Mahabir, who's a professor in the Department of English at Suffolk County Community College at the State University of New York. Joy is the author of Miraculous Weapons, Revolutionary Ideology and Caribbean Culture, and co-editor of Critical Perspectives on Indo-Caribbean Women's Literature. Her other publications include essays on visual arts, calypso and chutney music, and Indo-Caribbean jewelry. My work is done, and I'll turn it over to Rama.
And I want to start by thanking Heidi for inviting me and for organizing this panel and for all your fabulous work, Heidi, and the work that you are continuing to do. I have entitled this paper The Legacies of Coolie Bells, and you know who I'm talking about if you've seen the exhibition. If you haven't, please go and look at it before you leave. So I'll start. Who are the Coolie Bells of the 19th century? Famous and now notorious Felix Morin photographs / postcards that Heidi McKenzie has transferred to ceramic tiles in her hanging windows creation as an act of reclamation and decolonization. Well cared for, highly decorated with distinctive jewelry and beautiful Indian clothing, the young women named Coolie Bells appear in the tourist postcards as exotic objects of desire, smiling Orientalist figures in a colonial fantasy. A far cry from what historian Hugh Tinker has described as the participants in a new form of slavery. Part of the cargo of commodities, together with tea, porcelain from China, silks, calicos, and chintzes, sailing westward to provide labor in the production of the sugar needed, among other luxuries, to grace the tables and drawing rooms of an increasingly prosperous Britain. The labor of these Jahajans, of no more significance than the paraphernalia of imperialism expressed, as Lisa Lowe puts it in her magisterial text, The Intimacies of Four Continents, in intimate connections that have been so successfully erased by the historical accounts available to us that we, descendants of these Coolie Bells, have had to fight through acres of occluded facts even to identify and recognize them. And so let me salute Heidi on reclaiming the HerStories of the women who are our real and solid foremothers, and for creating this layered exhibition both to foreground the personal history and to contemporize the experiences of the descendants of these strong women, to give us an opportunity to celebrate them, to hold ancestry in our hands with pride and gratitude. Heidi's own ceramic works, set off by the actual jewelry of indenture, are gorgeous abstractions, responding in terms of her own artistic practice to the highly wrought filigree detail of the pieces she selected. act of reclamation, I have been thinking a lot about it since the opening of this exhibition on May 3rd, where I met and talked to several young women among the attendees who expressed amazement at how much they were unaware of their own histories. Throughout my many years of teaching Caribbean studies, I've encountered the same phenomenon. Indo-Caribbean students whose knowledge of their history is limited to stories passed down generationally, and these are the lucky ones. It is a vexing question, and even now, the history of indentureship of Indian and Chinese people exploited by the imperial world of Europe since the early 19th century, distributed globally as a cheap replacement labor source after the emancipation of enslaved Africans, has not made its way into the curricula of educational systems, is not counted as world history, is not listed among the world's great migrations that shape the world we live in today. And this despite the growing body of art and scholarship in the field. I understand the puzzlement of the young people I mentioned. In the Caribbean in which I grew up and was educated, I came to adulthood with only the scrappiest bits of information about indenture. The transatlantic trade in enslaved peoples was part of the curriculum, as was emancipation and abolition of the slave trade. But the fact that labor exploitation had continued on a global scale, utilizing Asian instead of African workers, was obscured. Thinking about it now, it's hard to imagine that the term indentureship was never part of our everyday vocabulary, though the pejorative term coolie was common. India was part of our history, that was obvious, but it was almost a fairy tale. It had happened so long ago. This differed within families, of course, and since indentures came to the Caribbean until 1917, those in the latter period had more access, perhaps, to their ancestry. Things are changing, and a lot of new things are happening in Trinidad regarding the history of indentureship and regarding visibility, but the pace is still agonizingly slow. Christianity, accompanied by access to education, arrived in Trinidad in 1868, barely 20 years after the first indentures did. In the succeeding years, among Indians, there was an astonishing degree of stratification in terms of class, depending upon the degree of adopting European and Canadian norms and values within their own communities, as well as adapting to the Creole society that surrounded them. All these changes were occurring within the Indian population. I'm thinking specifically of Trinidad now, while the larger society of Trinidad, and especially in the towns, viewed them as a homogeneous community known simply as coolies. You can see that it's really complicated. At first, conversion to Christianity was a necessity for access to education, but ways were found to circumvent that route, and Hinduism and Islam continued to thrive. But even among communities that continued religious practices and customs brought from India, the historical links were broken, and the vague idea of India in the background became the norm. It's important to note that the colonial curriculum had no focus on indentureship. In the early period, there was some effort among Canadian missionaries to teach Hindi, but this had to be done outside of regular classroom hours, and it was not very successful. The result was that in a couple of generations, the language was lost. In 1988, the 150th year of Indian arrival in the Caribbean, there was a lot of fanfare. Several conferences were held in the Caribbean and the diaspora. The curricula in some Caribbean countries began to develop to reflect this history, and there was a fair amount of visibility. But the moment passed, and indifference set in once more. In the early years of indenture, little attention was given to the gender ratio. The first ship, the Fatel Rozak, had a labor cargo of 182 men and 22 women. The numbers are still disputed, how many children, how many died at sea, etc. But the gender ratio is what I'm more concerned with here. Subsequent ships followed the same pattern, partly because in a place like India, it was difficult to recruit single women for the purposes of indenture. The competition for females in the colonies, especially in Trinidad and Guyana, the areas of greatest settlement, led to conflicts so frequent that British administrators gave it a term. It was called the coolie woman problem. Women were scarce, and those who were there asserted their independence. They refused ill treatment and simply walked away from abuse, and in many cases felt free to choose other spouses. But the result was often violence. One solution was the recruitment of widows. Their availability, a direct result of the British in 1829 banning the practice of sati, the custom of immolating widows on their husbands' funeral pyres. Now, when their husbands died, widows found that they had no place in their deceased husbands' homes. They were left destitute, wandering through the countryside, begging for alms or eking out a living as best they could. And so it was that Brahmin widows constituted a large number of the indentures who found their way across the Kalapani to the Caribbean. What women carried with them on the Jahaj were very few belongings, but their wherewithal was constituted within their very beings, the culture they carried, the customs, ways of life, skills they deployed in making their barracks and logis, and later tapia huts, homes, making them homes, brutal though the conditions were. Evidence of specific Indian vegetables, karaili, same, bindi, jingdi, and lauki, none of them native to the Caribbean, indicated that some migrants had traveled with the seeds of familiar vegetables. Women labored in the sugarcane fields alongside men, but they also labored at home, making vegetable gardens and tending to their families. Food rations were basic, as were the spices they were allocated. What they found and identified were native herbs, such as shadong beni, the holy thistle, now known widely as shadbeni, and which Indians identified as a wild species of dania, which is coriander. So they named it bandania, meaning wild coriander, the same herb known in South American cuisine as cilantro. I imagine the joy of recognition they must have felt in identifying the herb, reminding them of home in a new land marked by hostilities. Many Indian spices were unavailable, so they improvised, and a new Caribbean Indian cuisine began to emerge. Out of this crucible came a dazzling array of what became street foods: doubles, roti, paloris, sahinas, jira pork, bacon shark with a wide array of chutneys, and many more. Many became food entrepreneurs. In short, they survived. But in the process, they created many items which enriched and spread through the new terrain that was fast becoming home. Two items that may surprise some of you are the Jamaican staples, patties and curry goat. However, among the more settled population, aided by the divide and rule policies of empire, they were viewed as the lowest of the low. Field laborers, heathens, illiterates, non-English speaking, and non-European in food, dress, and culture. In Trinidad, as I've already mentioned, the presence of Canadian missionaries alleviated this climate of disdain to some degree because Indians were afforded the opportunity to attend CM, Canadian Mission denominational schools, where they were the majority. This was not the case in Guyana. I have just heard, though, from Kamala Kennedy that in fact there were multiple schools, Presbyterian schools as well, because I have always been told that the Canadian missions in Guyana met with relatively little success. I know in St. Lucia and Grenada there were Presbyterian ministries that were established with moderate success. All of this, however, was for the indentures. Education was in fact the big thing. 1 minute? 2. It soon became clear to Indians, for a variety of reasons, that the way back to India was difficult and uncertain, though their contracts guaranteed a return passage. And so, aided by the encouragement of small land grants, they began to settle in the territories where they landed. Education is seen as the ticket to achievement, social mobility, and success. The result was that in Trinidad, the Presbyterians managed, and Canadian Presbyterians I'm referring to, managed education for Indians for close to 100 years. The indentures prospered. They inhabited the Creole culture on their own terms as far as possible, but the undercurrent of disdain for their Hindu, Indian cultural customs and habits persisted to a significant degree, and I would argue that its undertow still informs social relations on the island, although the public discourse seeks to proclaim otherwise. The phenomenon of creolization, however, for everyone on this small island is seductive, persuasive, and pervasive. Its flow is uncontained and erupts in extraordinary instances of fusion, many simply stunning, such as soca and chutney music, the Jose Festival, and Carnival. Mixed race unions became more common, and the term Dougla was used for describing people of mixed African and Indian backgrounds. I'm winding up. Returning to the theme of Heidi's work, that of reclamation, the inclusion of the HerStories that she's reclaiming is neither casual nor accidental. Going back to Lisa Lowe, The Intimacies of Four Continents sets out the intricate intertwining of this history that must remain invisible. It cannot be that after the abolition of African enslavement, which produced so much of the wealth of Europe and the Americas, a new system emerges that brought coolies from India and China to fill the labor gap that ensued. Coolies provided the cheap labor needed on sugar plantations and construction of railways, to give just two examples. Cheap labor was necessary for the creation of the wealth of the West. We know that the need is still there today. It now occurs in the form of migrant labor, the details of which are similarly obscured. And I will end there. I wanted to end by dedicating a poem of mine called Jose Night to Heidi and to the exhibition. So I'm just telling you that another time.
I just wanted to say thank you so much to Heidi McKenzie for gifting us this important work. You and all the participants, many of whom I see here in the audience, your project, your stories that are so intricately and intimately linked, you're helping us reckon with our mothers and our grandmothers' memories, as well as the unspoken colonial histories. The images we see downstairs are not merely family photographs, free of history or political implications. No, by having her subjects hold portraits of their grandmother, Heidi has turned the camera to reveal how we all live inside these histories, and for that I thank you. Before I begin, I want to take a moment to remember my nanny, Shahideen Muhammad, who picked tanko beans for a living and did that to raise her surviving 6 children. She died young, and her death propelled my mother to leave Trinidad and to seek her own way in the world. Sometimes we don't have jewelry or photographs, only a feeling of something untraceable that remains. So I'm going to turn to the Mauritian poet, Cal Turabali. He writes, "If you had come from the sole contradiction of an open wound in the sea, your exile would be a rush of blood, but you come from a memory lost in advance. This woman is an island with saffron feet, whose blue womb is not a simple barrage of bougainvillea or anthurium blooms. She is the voice of your story, your life's void." I think it was a brilliant decision to transfer photographs onto the medium of ceramic tiles, which is a warm tone of tiles, and the translucency of the tiles moves us beyond this void. As the exhibit is entitled Indo-Caribbean HerStories, I want to give a brief background, which Rambai already gave us such a fulsome account into Indo-Caribbean women's experiences. I'm also focusing on Trinidad, and then I'm going to turn to the contributions of the exhibition. As we know, slavery was abolished in 1838 across the British Empire, and Indians were then shipped to Caribbean plantations beginning in 1838 until 1917. As Rambai has mentioned, both men and women were recruited not as families, but as individual laboring bodies, though significantly fewer women were indentured. For all the women who made that journey, it was a transgressive act. Freedom of mobility, venturing into unknown territories, these actions were considered dubious for women. Women migrating alone without a man were suspected of being morally debased, that is, suspiciously independent. And this was under both Indian and Victorian moral codes. As an aside, you can see in the family photos of Lancelyn Raymond Waters, here holding a picture of her own mother at age 3 in Guyana, dressed in Victorian dress, and juxtaposed against that is an image of her great aunts dressed in saris, wearing in almost as costumes, posed against a painted backdrop in a photography studio in Guyana. You can get a sense of the everyday negotiations between Victorian, Caribbean, and Indian life. So, returning to indentured women, the relative scarcity of Indian women were blamed for the numerous cases of wife murder, and Alyssa Trotz argues that this was part of the plantation logic. Quote, while men remained wedded to their traditional cultural ideas of superiority, it was disreputable and immoral women who became further emboldened under indentureship, who rebelled against their subordination to Indian men, and who ultimately paid the price for it with their lives, unquote. Because of the high rates of domestic violence, as well as the predations of European plantation managers, Gandhi and the Indian National Congress mounted a campaign to end indentureship in the late 19th century, early 20th century. For Gandhi and others, the Indian woman, compromised by migration and indentureship, endangered a chaste ideal of Hindu womanhood. This was an affront to the Indian nation. Hence, women, both in India and abroad, became a powerful symbolic site for struggle. Moving to the post-indentureship period in the 1930s, a wave of labor uprisings swept across the Caribbean due to deteriorating economic conditions. Just to give you one example, in Brechin Castle in Trinidad, in 1934, laborers went on strike, complaining of the size of their tasks, so they were paid not by wages, but by tasks completed. And during the Depression, planters not only reduced their wages, but also increased the size of the tasks, so that many women were unable to complete them. Women working in the weeding gang on this estate protested. They protested by beating the manager with their hose. This is but one example of collective militant action, a counter to the myth of the docile Indo-Caribbean women that you see portrayed on the Coolie Bell postcards. Many of the images that we see downstairs come to us through Dr. Amar Wahab's collection, as well as through the Montgomery collection at the AGO. And the photography studios that produced these postcards were, as Joy Mahabir notes, the elaborate jewelry and clothing serves to erase the real conditions of poverty, labor exploitation, and hazardous working conditions on the plantation. So these postcards, though they seem documentary, were not. And we can see by the choices that Heidi has made to juxtapose the images, we can see the complicated histories emerging from them. In another image that Heidi selected, we see the documentary aspect of these photographs of laborers, the exotic laborers on the plantation. However, Ariella Azule, who is a scholar that has informed Heidi's work, asks us to think beyond the photograph. What is a photograph? What does it enable? What does it not enable us to see? As Azule writes, photography is a central part of the imperial technology. But it's also in these glimpses where we can see barefoot cane cutters in colonial Jamaica, we have a sense of the lives forged in labor. About a decade ago, Premnath Gupta in Trinidad conducted interviews with aging sugar workers. One of the women he interviewed described how she would wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning to prepare meals for her husband and children. In the video portrait holding ancestry that accompanies the exhibit and available online, Cheryl Khan, pictured here in Ali's West Indian roti shop, note the motif of the boat in the background and the water. Khan tells us she learned to cook sahina, puluri, and doubles from her grandmother. She describes this as an inheritance of indentureship. She also tells us that she came to Canada at age 19 and is still working at age 70 in the beloved institution of Ali's Roti Shop in Parkdale. In a city where sterile condo developments threaten racialized and low-income communities, we must remember what Ali's Roti Shop gives us is more than delicious doubles. It's the warmth of community. It's a space where you can still go and pick up the local community newspaper, something like Share. It's a space where you can go lime. It's a community space reactivated through food and, as Khan reminds us, through the afterlives of indenture. Heidi asked the women portrayed here to share their portraits, perhaps portraits of their grandmothers or mothers, perhaps once hidden in display cabinets, and to share them with us, to share them with the public. In doing so, these co-created images are not just sharing memories, but also creating new narratives, narratives often invisible in institutions like the white boxes of galleries, who might merely see images like this as personal, or depoliticized. But what is missing in that kind of understanding is the invisible, the repetitions of migration history, and also the visible in the pictures, the future hopes and animated dreams that are intertwined across generations. The layers of time, past, present, and future, embodied intergenerationally and historically, are quite striking in these images. They show a relationship with the subject in the original photo, not an objectified woman like in the Cooley Bell photographs. So in summing up, I think Reclaimed Indo-Caribbean HerStories gives us 3 important contributions. Firstly, it is an assertion of presence, despite the power that obscures our presence. The powers, I should say. And Kamala Jean Gopi, in her video portrait that accompanies this exhibit, sums this up. She says, quote, "When I came here, I found it unusual people would ask me about my background, and I would say Indian, but their notion of Indian was Aboriginal people. So it was very difficult for them to make the connection. So I would say people from Italy are Italians, people from China are Chinese, my grandparents are from India, so we're Indians. I was betwixt and between. While I viewed myself as Indo-Caribbean, I had no real connections to India. And when I would say I was Jamaican and Indian, people couldn't quite come to terms with that. Jamaica is primarily a Black nation, so they didn't have space in their thinking for me." Secondly, Indo-Caribbean HerStories have been obscured through this thing called empire. Due to the anthropological work of Cooley Bell postcards that focus on cultural retention or the persistence of Indian traditions, Indo-Caribbean women were portrayed as if they were outside of history, unchanging and forever linked to an ancestral past, locked in stasis. The staggered light boxes challenge these traditional roles of Indian women. Even in the original photographs, the representations of self that in the clothing choice and stance challenge the idea of a victimized woman. As Ramabai Espinette wrote in her short story, Bard, Trinidad, 1987, quote, "I am Indian, plain and simple, not East nor West, just an Indian. I live in the West. My travel across the water to this land has not been easy, and many a time I have squatted in the dirt of this or that Lipade hut. A few coins knotted in the corner of my orney, waiting to make the next move. Moving away from a way of seeing the Indo-Caribbean woman as somehow deviant in relation to India, like Gandhi did. Instead, we see in these photographs, these double photographs, an assertion of cultural agency, adaptation, and resistance, another inheritance of indentureship. So, again, I want to thank Heidi McKenzie for this artistic expression of memory and genealogy, of the self in relation to community that anchors us all. And in returning to the poem that I opened with, I just want to say that Mackenzie's images gesture to an important question. Where have the seas taken us? And her work shines a light on our particular diaspora, up from the bottom of the sea. Thank you.
Also special thanks to the Gardiner Museum and to the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. Heidi's collection references the jewelry of indenture and early 20th century postcards issued by agricultural companies. So these postcards are very typical of the early 20th century postcards. As you will see, they are photographs of crops, and the laborers are actually subsumed into the landscape. So these are very, very typical early 20th century photographs. However, when it comes to images of Indo-Caribbean women, you can see that there's a stark and obvious shift in representation as the jewelry becomes central to these representations. The women are posed as adorned, domesticated, leisurely, and disciplined subjects. The ideology of the postcards, whether of crops, as we just saw, or women, is the same, serves the same purpose, and that is to render labor invisible. However, the actual interpretation of the jewelry by these women subverts the intention of the colonial postcards, because the Indo-Caribbean laborers were paid in silver shillings, and these shillings were converted into jewelry, and so these women are wearing their wages. So jewelry, therefore, signifies labor, and as well as the position of these women in the systems of indentureship and, at the time, global capital. So the women are wearing some of the typical pieces. So there's the elongated cuff, or the churia, so that's from wrist to elbow, bazu bands, or the armbands, heavy bearers, the necklaces such as chandahars, tilaries, and kantis, napus or nose rings, and toe and finger rings. So what I'm saying is that this jewelry meant something very different to these women, even though the photographers actually were representing this in a different way. But so I'm saying jewelry subverts the very intention of these colonial photographs. Okay, so what did the jewelry actually mean to indentured women? Wages, labor, resistance, freedom and independence, and symbolic gifts. Jewelry represented wages and labor. So women dictated the styles of the jewelry and were interested in representing symbols of their labor. In the cocoa plantations of northeast Trinidad, women chose to use cocoa pods at the ends of their bearers, and I've heard Trinidadian jewelers refer to these as cocoa pod bearers. So if you look at the bracelet, the bearer itself, you'll see that it's sort of minimalist in style, but women chose to wear their jewelry with an aesthetic of excess. This interplay of minimalism and excess is something that I think is one of the underlying deep structures of so many Indo-Caribbean forms. So if you think of tassa, chutney, even cuisine, we see that contradiction, or interplay rather. One very important feature of the jewelry is that it represents labor resistance. The photograph on the right is actually a photograph from India. And when we think of contributions of Indians to the Caribbean, people often talk about food or dress or music. And what we have to remember is that there's a very long tradition of peasant insurgency. And so the jewelry represents, one of the very powerful meanings of the jewelry is labor resistance. And I think this idea is captured in Ramabai Espinet's novel, The Swinging Bridge, where she states, quote, "Women's bodies covered with thick silver from wrist to elbow, ankle to mid-calf, would become walking banks, repositories of their family's wealth. The metal carapace served another purpose too, that of a weapon that could crush the head of an unwary attacker when wielded by an arm unafraid of the swing of its power," end quote. So these lines allude to the way Indo-Caribbean women participated in estate strikes, especially in Guyana and Trinidad. At one time in the early 20th century in the Naparima region, there were 10 estate strikes at the same time, and women were very much involved in those strikes. And we think of these women raising their hands with the jewelry, as a very powerful and beautiful symbol of resistance. Another thing that the jewelry represented is freedom and independence. Jewelry was often used as collateral for loans, and women used it to purchase land, to start small businesses, or pay for their children's education. In her novel, Jahajin, Peggy Mohan notes that the women in Trinidad, that is, shifted to wearing gold to show their distance from the plantation and from estate labor. These are my grandmother's pieces. The bearer on the right was actually made at home. So this was a custom in the old days where jewelers would come to the home, and when they were creating the jewelry, a crowd would gather. And I think that this communal gathering also symbolized that the crowd, the community, would recognize that this is our sense of aesthetics, and this is what is beautiful to us. So, so this is one of the most important. Now, when these pieces, usually these pieces would be broken up to be passed down to the younger generations. So the traditional Indian practice of giving jewelry to newborn children, to boys and girls, to brides, etc., still practiced. And the jewelry also, so as I said before, the long churia were broken up, they were broken up to pass on. The styles from indentureship have remained because of the significance and the meaning of jewelry in Caribbean consciousness. So Indo-Caribbean jewelry, it's seen on all of the islands and in diasporic spaces. And the jewelry has changed a little, so the iconic visuals such as anthuriums, hibiscus, orchids, we've seen those pieces at the ends of bearers and also maps of islands. I've seen there are maps of islands in several carnivals, and so many people wear it to show what island they're from. Now another aspect of the jewelry is that I've often seen them used as offerings. So to the Hindu goddesses, Durga, Lakshmi, and Saraswati, and their incarnations. And in New York, I've seen them on the Lukumi altars of Oshun and Yemaya. And so it's offered to the goddesses to emphasize their feminine, sensual, and spiritual power. Okay. So Heidi's piece bangle, I think, captures so many elements of the jewelry, all those reference. But there's something else that I saw, and this was sort of my first with the idea of jewelry. There was something else, and I think because of the colors used here, the blues and greens and silver and gray, it seems to also represent the ocean, and it reminded me of the Kalapani crossing, that journey across the Atlantic from India to the Caribbean. And we think especially, as Ramabai mentioned, of the widows. Now when young girls, especially women, became widowed in India, their bangles would be broken, their hair would be shorn, and so they would not be able to have any jewelry, and they were white. And these widows, we think of these widows who possessed no jewelry, who boarded the ship, and but they could reinvent their lives in the Caribbean. Widowed since 8, her bangles shattered, her bare hand immersed in blue-green waters. Kalapani voyage ends, new journeys begin. Her arm, wrapped in silver, raises fearlessly into a fist. Thank you.
What an absolutely wonderful panel. Thank you so much. We're going to open to questions, but before I wanted to invite Rama to share her poem. Rama featured in everybody's presentation. At one point she was sitting underneath her portrait. So I'm going to open to Rama and then we'll go to audience questions.
Thank you, Alyssa. So Heidi, I would like to dedicate this reading to you and to the exhibition. It's a poem called Jose Night, and it's from my collection, Nuclear Seasons. Like a key turning in the rusty iron lock of memory, shadows filter past the thin, skinless eye of moon, now cutting through the knife blue sky. And like echoes off an old skin drum, drawn across the lash of memory, the mind bitter patters. Jose Night, in deep-edged St. James dark, where drumsticks rain fire and portholes back. I was a small boy on flat night, a small girl on Ganges Street, watching the Tajas. Near the mosque door, the sun and moon kissed. Straw fires lined the streets, stirring a dim morning dream of colder times, ancient streets, fires for warming hands and drums, tribesmen, plainsmen, my grandfather's pale eyes and swarthy hands. A journey outside the lodge of memory, the cutting edge of bitter cane. Behind the moon on God's back, pain knowing no end, we lived alone, like shadow, murdering shadow. The stars alone for safety, horses beating in the dark, rum, stick fight, chulas, flights to nowhere. This land is home to me, now homeless, a true refugee of the soul's last corner. Sadhu days and Babu days and Mai and Orni days lost to me, like elephants and silks, the dows of Naipaul's yearning, not mine.
Thank you. So we have about 20 minutes. The bar is going to close at 8:15, so we're going to try to leave you with about 15 minutes to get a last drink and chat informally. But we have about 20 minutes. I wonder who wants to open. And I will run with the mic.
How long was the journey from India?
Oh, can you?
How long was the journey from India to Guyana or Trinidad? Yes.
Sometimes as long as 3 to 4 months, and in some cases longer, when if they ran into trouble, because it was very treacherous. Yeah, so approximately 2 months, I think, on average, but it could be much longer.
Thank you.
Could you just review the route, right? The route, just review the route described, right? Just quickly.
Okay, well, quickly. Usually from Calcutta, sometimes on rare occasions from Madras as well. But from Calcutta, along the Bay of Bengal, all the way down across the Cape of Good Hope. And that was called the Pagal Samundar, meaning the Mad Sea, because it was so treacherous. And then they would go up the coast of Africa, stop at St. Helena, and often for refueling or to get supplies and so on, and then on the way to the. And they also, in the later stages, they picked up a few African indentures there in St. Helena. I was amazed when I found that out. But some work has been done on that, and then all the way and from there to the Caribbean.
Yes. If you could just identify yourself if you're okay with that.
My name is Stephanie. Thank you for historicizing Roma by the history of indentureship. You mentioned indentured servants were given land grants. Could you unpack that a bit?
Okay, so this was an incentive to get them to stay in the Caribbean and, of course, supply them with labor because it was extremely expensive to make the journey and very expensive for the planters. So eventually, they were guaranteed a return passage, but it was very, very difficult for them to actually find out when a ship was there or even to get the passage. So, but that was a guarantee that they were given. But then they began to give them land grants, and the lands offered, both men and women got land grants, as far as I know, but they often got it as families, but single women could get it. And so it was anywhere between 2 and 5 acres, at least in Trinidad. I don't know, what, do you have anything?
In Guyana, this happened, but coming on to the end of indentureship. So it was an attempt, because under your contract, you were supposed to be allowed to go back. But by the time the indentureship was coming to an end, they had to figure out ways of keeping Indians in the Caribbean. And so the land grants, because land laws had been very restrictive in the post-emancipation period, so the liberalization was really an attempt to keep Indians at home. And it wasn't good land that they were given. They were often given land right next to the plantation, little small bits of land. So it was an attempt to keep them, but not an attempt. It's actually really fascinating to me. I didn't know Ali Kazemi and Heidi were partners, because it's interesting that at the very same time that they're trying to keep Indians in the Caribbean, they're trying to ensure that Indians don't actually come to Canada. And Ali has done a film, The Continuous Journey, about this period. And in fact, there was a big parliamentary debate in the early 20th century in Canada called the Hindu Woman's Question, which was about if you bring Indian women in here, the argument was, if you bring them in here, some people were saying bring them in here because because then the Indian men won't marry white women, so we won't have to deal with that. But others were saying, don't bring them in because then the Indian men will stay. But it was interesting that at the very same time that there were these attempts to keep Indians out of Canada, right in the Americas, there's an attempt to entice Indian women to Guyana, Trinidad, and parts of the Caribbean so that you could keep cheap labor in the region after indentureship came to an end.
I just wanted to add that only a small, very small percentage of Indians got land in Trinidad. However, there's a perception in Trinidad that the reasons why Indians are successful is because they were given land. So that's a kind of myth in Trinidad that I've heard. Sometimes I go and I give talks for Indian arrival there, and somebody in the audience will always bring that up.
I just wanted to add one more thing to that. They got land, but very few of them were able to keep the land because they had to, they mortgaged the land to pay for weddings and things, and then they couldn't pay back the mortgage. So there are very few of them, well, I think relatively few of them got to actually keep the land and hand it on to the rest of the family, the descendants. Yes.
I have a loud voice, I could just talk. Use the mic, okay. Thank you. So my name's Ryan Singh. I run an organization called the Indo-Caribbean HerStories Association. And the reason why we started that was to complement the work that you guys are doing and amplifying our community. And during this time and working with our volunteers, one of the things I find when we're discovering our history is the loneliness and isolation. Even within Caribbean circles, sometimes we're not even seen as being part of that. Despite doubles, Czech music, even soca has South Asian influences. So I didn't want to ask a question necessarily about indentureship or our history, but what's the journey been like for you and Heidi, being in spaces where you're sometimes the only person of Indian ancestry, trying to give a voice, trying to learn with limited resources. So I'd love to learn more about the four of you.
I'm going to give the mic first to the person who coined the term colonizer, fish in our fowl, to talk about what it meant to be Indian in
Jamaica.
Canada and Jamaica.
I'm Kamala Gopi, and I'd like to say that, when Kamala Harris became the vice officer and everybody kept, oh, that's how you say your name, and she's like you, Indian and Jamaican at the same time. This is our father's Jamaican, mother from India now, and I'm Jamaican. I was ashamed to be a coolie in Jamaica. I was told the only thing I could be was a coolie gown to sell callaloo on Spanish Town Road. Okay, that's how I grew up. I went to a school for Indian girls run by Quakers in Jamaica. The very first time in my life that I sort of felt good in myself that I was Indian was in 1963 in New York. There was an Indian man on the subway and he smiled at me. And I thought, God, somebody recognized who I am. Because in New York, when I said I was Indian, the blacks couldn't figure out who I was. And there were a few Indians around, like me. And of course, their notion of Indians were the people whom Columbus misnamed because he made a mistake. And so we have perpetuated that historical mistake. That was the first time. The second time I began to value myself as a coolie, as an Indian, was when I worked with Ramabai and Dr. Frank Burleson to mark the 150th anniversary of Indian arrival in the Caribbean. We did a lot of work at York University. That was in 1989. And the third time that I was secure in myself, proud to be who I am, was when I went to picture of Krishna and the gopis by his side. So for me, I'm 81, and it's taken me a while to get to the place where I'm proud of who I am and I value my heritage. And so I have goosebumps when I look around and I see that I'm not in a space where I'm a minority, constantly trying to explain myself. And I worked with, New College, and back then I worked with some Indo-Caribbean students, and we set up scholarships at New College. One in the name of Rohan Kanai, one Sam Selvin, and one in my name. And those were
I didn't realize y'all were involved in it tonight. That was my last year at York, and Shiromani Bisandiara had done a whole play that year. I hope y'all have archived all of that for this generation.
That's the time it was. Yeah, sorry. I just thank you so much, Kamala Jean, for sharing. And I urge you all to listen to the video that accompanies the portrait of Kamala. She will tell you even more. And I just wanted to respond to Ryan, your question. Because I was born and raised in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the east coast of Canada, and really it was in the high 90s, settler white community. And my mother is white, was passed, but my father came from Trinidad in 1953. And I think, extremely long story short, he checked his cultural baggage at the door due to a lot of colonial and racist trauma that he experienced. And I grew up on, mashed potatoes, fish on Friday. And it really actually wasn't until I came to Toronto to study at the University of Toronto in Scarborough. And really actually, I'm remembering now my cousin Anya McKenzie, who's here. I remember the moment that Anya taught me to cook my first West Indian curry. I don't know, I just felt moved to tell you that there is a lot to be said for being in community, and coming to Scarborough in particular, it was an instantaneous community of Caribbean peoples coming from really a complete void. And just to tell you that my father, after his retirement, embraced his heritage and history and went back and learned and so on.
Thank you. I'm learning and hearing your experiences. I'm also interested in the present. I'm curious, how are the Indians in the Caribbean faring politically, socially, or economically? Or are they still migrating out?
Okay, so we use it in Indo-Caribbean, but because the islands are so different, we have to look at different islands. So Indo-Trinidadians have a very different experience from Indo-Guyanese people. We think of Indians in Guadeloupe, in St. Lucia, in Grenada. So it's all different, and sometimes we say Indo-Caribbean a lot in the diaspora, but I'm finding that I want to be more specific and think, more about Trinidad itself or Guyana itself. So it's all very, very different depending on the island. Even though, in general, all of the islands now have to face to what's going on globally and live within the structures of global capitalism. So, so I just stopped there.
Yeah. Thank you. It's complex.
It is complex. And one of the things I'd like to add is we use Indo-Caribbean, that term, which really came about as an academic term. In the Caribbean, you will not hear anyone saying that. They are simply Indian, and that's enough for them. And if they want to be polite, they say East Indian. which does not exist in my view, because it was just the East India Company. So, well, but East Indian, but everybody in the Caribbean, nobody uses that term, as far as I know, Indo-Caribbean. Come on.
Just to interject there.
Please take.
No, but just to interject there, in Suriname, where there's a large Indo-Caribbean population, the Indos are actually from Java, the Indonesians. So the term Indo doesn't resonate in the same way.
Yeah.
What term do they use? What would be
Hindustani.
Hindustani. For Muslims as well as Hindus.
Yeah.
Yes, at the back. Oh, y'all make me walk.
Hello, everyone. My name is Vanessa. You should know come out. I just have a question for the panel. Knowing that our ancestors went through such turbulence to get to where they ended up in the Caribbean, what piece of advice do you have now for the younger generation for us to use that knowledge and to keep this culture alive, but in a progressive way?
Thank you. That's an amazing question. I personally feel really excited when I see what's happening on social media, when I look at Twitter and see like the Cutlass podcast, the Brown Girl magazine, the blog by Rashid Mahadir. I just feel like there's a lot of resources that are taking the history, but also using it to create new visions and new imaginings of who we are in this space that we find ourselves in, and are also, I think, working through topics that might have been taboo, say 10, 20 years ago, such as queer identities, sexualities, and so on. And so I find that work really inspiring.
What the lady is saying is the eldest one has much to learn from you. Mr. Blake.
I want to respond to the gentleman there who was asking about how the Indians in Trinidad participate in the structure per se. Indians are in every walk of life, and they have an interesting development. I know from my times where you have the colonials leaving and you get independence. And with independence came a guy named Eric Williams. It is not, what I'm about to talk about is not simple, it's very complex.
You have 3 minutes.
I will not take anyhow. And what happens there is Eric Williams was able to smash the Afro and Indian together and develop a government for the country. So they were independent, and Indians and Afro ran the country. Doctor, lawyer, priest, everything.
Leave that alone. Hand at the back.
I'm in education. I work for the Toronto District School Board. So I have a question. I notice when I talk to a lot of children from India, they do not know, or they make comments about, or their family members will say, you're the Indians that went on the wrong boat. So I just wanted to pose that question. As history continuously being changed or being exposed, do Indians from India understand the narration and the story of the lived experiences of the, I say West Indian, because that's how I grew up as, but Indo-Caribbean? I'm just posing it out there because it's an interesting conversation when I hear it in this space, but when I step out, it's totally different.
I just want to say one thing about that, and that is that if you think of the population of India, and the population that left and went not only to the Caribbean, but to South Africa, Mauritius, Fiji, and elsewhere, it's a drop in the bucket. I mean, this is not to excuse anybody for anything, but it's just a very small number. And there are scholars and other people, activists in India, who are in fact trying to do work that tells the story from the Indian point of view. Well, I mean, there aren't many, but from the Indian point of view, about those who journeyed out. But it's not a well-known story in India. In fact, it's probably one of the stories. Labor, India keeps supplying labor to the Middle East, for example. It's not a well-known story. So, and other than that, there is a divide because there's a lot of snobbery. And I think most Indo-Caribbean people will, admit that. There's a lot of snobbery among Indians who came straight from India, largely of the professional class, and Indians who came here from the Caribbean. It is thought that they were low caste, and caste raises its thorny head wherever we go. So yeah, there's a lot of there's a big divide, and the continental Indians. Well, I don't even know if I should call them that, but they are. There's a big divide.
And if I could just add to that, because you're at you're in education, I just want to make a point of advocacy that if you look at the kinds of material on multiculturalism that the Toronto School Board publishes, such as those census portraits, if you look at the South Asian census portrait, they have, it's obviously very homogenizing, but if you look at every exception to that, it's Ghanese, right? Indo-Ghanese specifically. South Asians are, successful in high school, getting good grades, are graduating, going on to university and so on, with the exception of, and it's always Ghanese. So it seems, why aren't they probing why every exception is Indo-Caribbean, and does it need to be lumped in to this category of South Asian that I don't think describes us at all, and it's a category that comes out of a post-partition moment, so long after Indo-Caribbean people left the subcontinent. So maybe that's a point you can raise with the people who run those reports.
Trust me, it's a big fight. Thank you, Lily. We're going to take two quick questions. Lily may have to leave because she has another engagement, but we're going to take two quick questions as our final questions. And then I see you.
Thanks so much. Hi, I'm Amanda. I actually work for the DEI space, so this has been a really great conversation, and I appreciate all the information that you've shared today. My question for you is actually a two-parter. So, one, I know that you've done a ton of research and you've told really great stories. Is there anything that sticks out in your mind as something that you found as a fun fact, or perhaps maybe a not so fun fact as you've sort of done your research? And then my second question is, if we wanted to do additional research and learn more about these topics, what would you recommend as sort of like a one source or two sources from each of you that would be great?
Wonderful. And we'll just take the last question and then. Is someone here had their hand?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, sorry. Thank you. I wanted to say, first of all, thank you for illuminating me on the histories of Indo-Caribbean women. My family is from East Africa, and our ancestry is also Southeast Indian, Asian, but lost because we came over in the end of the 19th century and from Zanzibar intermixed and moved with the Arabs into into the continent. And I was fascinated because I saw so many links between the stories of the Indo-Caribbean women and the few that I have. Like, we have even less, I think, history than the histories that you've shared. So I wanted to say thank you for starting this journey, and I'm hopeful that maybe my community will be able to be inspired and to reclaim some of our stories too. So thank you very much.
So just one set of questions here. So if anyone wants to take the questions asked by the other.
I don't know that I would recommend any particular book. There's a big move to actually discover and write, and people are doing a lot of work. So I can't see your face, but yeah, I think that if you do some digging around, there are a lot of sources available, and they weren't always, but now there are, and there are films, and there are all kinds of ways in which you can discover more. And also, I don't know if we can give you a bibliography and how that will be done, but you can, a basic bibliography, maybe Heidi can post, where's Heidi? She can post something on his site or something, yeah. And you can access it there.
I would also say that don't forget we have several Indo-Caribbean novelists and poets. So being someone who teaches literature, I would like you to start reading our writers, our creative writers.
Starting with Ramabai,
Yeah.
And also right here in Canada, Shani Matu. So those are two names to begin with. I want to thank the audience. You've been wonderful. The young people as well, especially for your questions. Our panelists, you've been absolutely amazing. That bracelet, I had never heard that about the fruit, and that really has stayed with me. So thank you so much, Joy, Nalini, and Rama, and Heidi, who has inspired us all. I'm going to give her the mic to say thanks and bring this evening to a close. It was just a pleasure to join you today.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. And to the panelists, I'm honored and thrilled that you shared so deeply and generously of your knowledge. And thank you for coming out this evening. And I just want to encourage you to continue to share our stories and your stories